The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink as it descended over a quiet truck stop nestled just off Highway 74. The place had an air of stillness about it, the kind that made it seem like nothing ever happened there. Rows of semi-trucks lined the gravel lot, their drivers taking a much-needed break from long hours on the road. A neon sign buzzed faintly over the diner, the flickering letters spelling out Dixie's Stop and Dine, a beacon for weary travelers. Jack Carter pulled his rig into the lot, the rumble of the engine fading as he turned the key and stepped out. He moved with a deliberate ease, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward the diner. To anyone watching, he was just another trucker. Worn jeans, a plain t-shirt under a faded leather jacket, and a cap that shadowed his weathered face. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, not the kind born of arrogance, but of experience. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was warm but subdued. The smell of coffee and fried food filled the air, mingling with the faint strains of a country song playing on the jukebox. A few truckers sat in booths, their conversations low and tired, while a waitress moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Jack found a seat near the window, the kind that let him keep an eye on the room without drawing attention to himself. He wasn't trying to be mysterious, it was just a habit he'd picked up over the years, one he couldn't seem to shake. As he settled in, his eyes briefly scanned the diner. There was nothing unusual, nothing to set off alarm bells. Just the ordinary hum of people going about their lives. The waitress approached, a pad in hand and a polite smile on her face. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice carrying the friendly drawl of the South. "Coffee," Jack said simply. "Black." She nodded and walked away, leaving Jack to his thoughts. He leaned back in the booth, his gaze drifting out the window to the fading light of the evening. Jack Carter wasn't just another traveler, though no one here would have guessed it. His unassuming appearance was a kind of armor, a way to blend in and avoid unnecessary questions. But beneath that exterior was a man shaped by a life few could imagine. Jack was a retired Marine, his service marked by courage and sacrifice. Over the years, he'd been in places and situations that would haunt most people for a lifetime. He'd seen combat up close, felt the weight of responsibility that came with leading men into danger, and carried the scars both visible and hidden that came with it. He had been decorated for valor more times than he cared to count, but those medals were tucked away in a box somewhere, reminders of a life he'd left behind. These days, Jack preferred the open road. Driving gave him a sense of purpose without the chaos of his former career. It was simple, straightforward, a far cry from the complex, high-stakes world he once navigated. And yet, no matter how far he drove, the Marine in him never quite left. His instincts were sharp, his mind alert, always assessing, always ready. But today, Jack wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't trying to save the world or win a fight. He just wanted a hot coffee, maybe a meal, and a few moments of peace before hitting the road again. The waitress returned with his coffee, placing the steaming mug in front of him. "Anything else?" she asked, her pen hovering over the pad. Jack shook his head. "This is fine, thanks." She smiled again and moved on to the next table, leaving Jack to his quiet corner. He wrapped his hands around the mug, letting its warmth seep into his fingers. Outside, the neon sign flickered, and a few more trucks rolled into the lot. For Jack, it was just another ordinary stop. At least, that's what he thought. What he didn't know was that the peace of the evening was about to shatter, and the quiet truck stop would soon become the stage for a confrontation that no one, least of all Jack, saw coming. Jack sipped his coffee, the bitter warmth spreading through him. It wasn't the best cup he'd ever had, but it served its purpose. Outside, the faint hum of engines and the occasional crunch of gravel underfoot were the only sounds that broke the silence. The truck stop seemed caught in a time warp, its old-fashioned charm unchanged by the passing years. As he gazed out the window, Jack let his mind wander. He thought about the road ahead, the miles he had yet to cover, and the solitude that came with it. He didn't mind being alone, sometimes he even preferred it. The long stretches of highway gave him time to think, to reflect, though some memories were better left untouched. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips as he thought about his daughter, Ellie. She was grown now, with a family of her own, but she still called him every Sunday without fail. "Just checking in, Dad," she'd say, her voice always filled with warmth. Those calls were one of the few things Jack looked forward to. The bell above the diner door jingled, pulling Jack from his thoughts. He glanced up, his instincts kicking in even though he told himself there was no reason for it. A group of men walked in, their laughter loud and brash, cutting through the calm atmosphere. There were 5 of them, dressed in leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols. They looked rough around the edges, bikers, most likely. Their presence immediately changed the energy in the room. Conversations quieted, and the waitress hesitated for a fraction of a second before resuming her work. Jack watched them without staring, his practiced eyes taking in the details. They were younger than him, in their 30s or 40s, and carried themselves with a swagger that bordered on arrogance. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head and a scar running down his cheek, seemed to be the leader. The group claimed a booth in the corner, their voices carrying across the diner as they joked and ordered food. They weren't doing anything overtly threatening, but their presence was hard to ignore. Jack could see the other patrons shifting uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the group and then quickly away. The waitress approached the bikers, her notepad in hand and a polite smile plastered on her face. "What can I get you?" she asked, her tone professional but slightly strained. The leader grinned, leaning back in the booth. "How about a smile to start with?" he said, his voice dripping with mock charm. The other bikers laughed, and the waitress forced a chuckle, jotting down their orders as quickly as she could. Jack's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. He wasn't one to intervene unless absolutely necessary. As the waitress walked away, the leader's gaze swept across the diner, lingering on Jack for a moment longer than was comfortable. Jack didn't react, keeping his eyes on his coffee. He'd been in enough situations to know that drawing attention to himself wouldn't help. "Hey, old man," the leader called out suddenly, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the diner. Jack looked up slowly, his expression calm and unreadable. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his tone even. The leader smirked. "Just wondering what a guy like you is doing all alone in a place like this. Don't you have a bingo game to get to?" The group erupted in laughter, and Jack simply raised an eyebrow. He didn't respond, letting their laughter die down on its own. The leader seemed disappointed by the lack of reaction. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Jack took another sip of his coffee, setting the mug down with deliberate care. "I'm just here for the coffee," he said, his voice steady. The leader's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. "Yeah, well, maybe we don't like the way you're looking at us." "I wasn't looking at you," Jack replied, his tone still calm. "But if you're feeling self-conscious, that's not my problem." The tension in the diner thickened, the air heavy with anticipation. The other patrons avoided eye contact, their discomfort palpable. The leader's grin returned, but it was sharper now, less friendly. "You've got a smart mouth for an old-timer," he said, his voice low. Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for his wallet, pulling out a few crumpled bills and placing them on the table. "Keep the change," he said to the waitress, who was hovering nearby, clearly uneasy. As Jack stood, the leader rose as well, blocking his path. He was taller than Jack, broader too, but there was something in Jack's demeanor that gave him pause. Jack didn't flinch, didn't step back. He simply looked at the man, his gray eyes steady and unyielding. "I don't want any trouble," Jack said quietly. Trouble. The leader laughed, but it lacked genuine humor. Who said anything about trouble? I just think maybe you need to learn some respect. Jack's hands remained at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. He could feel the eyes of the diner on him, the weight of their silent hope that he wouldn't escalate things. You don't want to do this, Jack said, his voice calm but firm. The leader's smirk faltered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But pride or perhaps the need to impress his friends pushed him forward. The diner grew so quiet that the faint hum of the jukebox seemed deafening. Jack didn't move, didn't speak. He was waiting, his mind calculating every possible outcome. He wasn't a man who started fights, but he knew how to end them. And though the leader didn't realize it yet, he was about to learn that the hard way. The peaceful hum of the truck stop shattered as the roar of motorcycles pierced the evening air. One by one, the bikes rolled in, their chrome glinting in the fading sunlight. The gang of bikers moved like a pack of wolves, their engines snarling and echoing across the quiet lot. They parked with careless arrogance, their machines sprawled across multiple spaces as if claiming the stop as their territory. The sound was impossible to ignore. Jack Carter's hand paused mid-reach for his coffee mug, his sharp instincts humming. Years in the Marines had taught him to sense the shift in the air, the subtle signs that something was about to go wrong. And tonight, his gut was sending up flares. From his booth by the window, Jack had a clear view of the newcomers. They were a rough-looking bunch, leather vests covered in patches, tattoos snaking up their arms and necks. Each of them carried an air of menace, the kind that didn't need words to announce itself. The leader, a towering man with a shaved head and a thick beard, wore a vest emblazoned with a skull and crossbones emblem on the back. It was clear from the way the others deferred to him that he was in charge. Jack's eyes flicked back to his coffee. He wasn't here to get involved in anyone else's business. The gang swaggered into the diner, their boots thudding heavily against the linoleum floor. Conversations halted as heads turned toward the group. The waitress froze for a split second, her smile faltering before she recovered and approached them with her notepad. "What can I get y'all?" she asked, her voice steady but strained. "Anything worth eating in this dump," one of the bikers shot back, his tone dripping with disdain. The waitress forced a polite laugh and began listing the specials, but they interrupted her with loud, crude jokes. Their laughter was coarse and mocking, filling the space with an oppressive tension. Jack remained silent, his focus outwardly on his coffee, but his senses were on high alert. He had seen this type before, loud, looking for attention, thriving on intimidation. As long as they stayed in their corner, he planned to stay in his. But trouble has a way of seeking out the quiet ones. "Hey, old man." The deep, gravelly voice boomed across the diner, silencing the low hum of chatter. Jack looked up to see the leader staring directly at him, a mocking grin spreading across his face. "You lose your walker, or are you just too cheap to get a jacket that doesn't look like it's from the Stone Age?" the man jeered. The rest of the gang roared with laughter, slapping the table and howling like hyenas. Jack stirred his coffee slowly, his expression calm and unreadable. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The leader, who the others called Bear, wasn't done. He stood up, towering over the others, and took a step closer to Jack's booth. His movements were deliberate, calculated, a predator closing in on what he thought was easy prey. "Come on, Grandpa," Bear said, his grin widening. "Don't tell me you're gonna sit there and pretend you don't hear me." Jack finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting Bear's without a hint of fear. "I hear you just fine," he said evenly. The simple statement, delivered in a steady voice, seemed to deflate the bikers' laughter for a moment. There was no fear in Jack's tone, no anger, just calm. Bear cocked his head, clearly not expecting such a composed response. "Well, look at that," he said, smirking again. "The old man's got some guts. I like that." Jack didn't reply. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Bear's. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The other patrons sat frozen, their gazes darting between Jack and the gang. The waitress stood behind the counter, her hand gripping the edge tightly. Bear leaned closer, resting his massive hands on the edge of Jack's table. "But guts'll only get you so far, old man," he said, his voice low and threatening. Jack set his mug down slowly, his movements deliberate. He didn't stand, didn't flinch, just looked up at the man towering over him. "I'm just trying to enjoy my coffee," he said, his tone as steady as ever. "Is that right?" Bear's voice was louder now, designed to draw more attention. "Well, maybe you should buy me and my boys a round of coffee. You know, as a show of respect." The gang erupted in laughter again, egging their leader on. Jack's gaze didn't waver. "Respect's earned, not bought," he said quietly. The laughter died down immediately, replaced by a tense silence. Bear straightened, his smirk replaced by a scowl. He was used to people cowering, used to being the one in control. But Jack wasn't giving him that. "You've got a smart mouth," Bear said, his voice colder now. "Maybe someone needs to teach you some manners." Jack remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't move, but there was a subtle shift in his posture barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. The kind of shift that signaled readiness, not fear. The other bikers exchanged glances, their bravado faltering. Even they could sense something in Jack that didn't quite add up. He wasn't acting like a man who was out of his depth. The waitress stepped forward, her voice shaky but brave. "Sir, maybe you should leave him alone," she said, addressing Bear. Bear turned to her, his expression darkening. "Mind your business," he snapped, his voice sharp. Jack's eyes flicked to the waitress, then back to Bear. He didn't like bullies, especially ones who turned on people who were just trying to do their jobs. "Let her be," Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Bear turned back to him, his fists clenching. "Or what?" he challenged, leaning closer. Jack held his gaze, unblinking. "You don't want to find out?" The air in the diner seemed to crackle with electricity. The bikers shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh or prepare for a fight. The other patrons sat frozen, barely daring to breathe. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching, Jack Carter wasn't just some ordinary trucker. He was a man who had seen real danger, faced it head on, and come out the other side. And if Bear pushed any further, he was about to find out exactly what that meant. Bear's scowl deepened. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, on fear. He had made a name for himself as someone you didn't cross, a leader of a pack that took what it wanted, when it wanted. But this quiet man sitting in the booth, sipping his coffee as if nothing could touch him, was a problem Bear didn't know how to solve. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Bear said, his voice low and full of menace. "But guts don't mean squat when you're outnumbered." Jack tilted his head slightly, as though considering the statement. "Outnumbered doesn't mean outmatched," he replied evenly. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. They didn't understand it, but something about Jack's calm demeanor was unsettling. He wasn't posturing, wasn't bluffing. There was a quiet confidence in his words, the kind that didn't need to be shouted to be believed. One of the younger bikers, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, leaned forward. "Come on, Bear," he said, his voice loud and eager. "Let's teach this old-timer a lesson." Bear hesitated for a fraction of a second, his instincts warning him that something wasn't right. But pride and the expectations of his gang overruled his better judgment. "All right," Bear said, straightening up. "Let's step outside, old man. Show me what you've got." Jack didn't move immediately. He took another slow sip of his coffee, then placed the mug back on the table with care. He reached for his wallet, pulling out a couple of bills and laying them beside the check. "For the coffee," he said to the waitress, his tone polite. Then he stood, stretching slightly as though he'd just finished a long drive. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath as Jack turned to face Bear. He wasn't particularly tall or broad, but there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. "Lead the way," Jack said simply. The bikers hooped and hollered, their excitement spilling over as they followed Bear out the door. Jack walked calmly behind them, his step steady and measured. The other patrons exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what was about to happen but certain it wasn't going to be good. Outside, the air was cooler, the night settling in. The parking lot was dimly lit by a couple of flickering overhead lights. The bikers formed a loose circle, their motorcycles idling like growling beasts in the background. Bear cracked his knuckles loudly, grinning as he faced Jack. "I'll give you one chance to back down," he said, his voice dripping with mock generosity. Jack stood still, his hands resting lightly at his sides. "I told you inside," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You don't want to do this." The quiet conviction in Jack's words made Bear pause again. But the laughter and jeers from his crew pushed him forward. He had a reputation to uphold, and he wasn't about to let some old guy ruin it. Bear lunged forward, his fist swinging in a wide arc aimed at Jack's head. But Jack didn't flinch. He stepped to the side with practiced ease, the punch missing him by inches. Before Bear could recover, Jack's hand shot out, grabbing Bear's wrist and twisting it sharply. The movement was so fast, so fluid, that it took everyone a moment to realize what had happened. Bear let out a pained grunt, dropping to one knee as Jack applied pressure to his wrist. "Rule number 1, Jack said quietly, his voice carrying in the stillness. "Never telegraph your moves." Bear tried to yank his arm free, but Jack's grip was like iron. He released Bear abruptly, sending the larger man stumbling backward. The gang erupted into chaos, their bravado crumbling as they realized their leader had been outmaneuvered. One of them, a stocky man with a chain dangling from his belt, rushed forward, swinging the chain like a whip. Jack ducked under the swing, stepping inside the man's reach. A quick strike to the ribs and a sweep of the legs sent the biker crashing to the ground, gasping for air. Two more bikers charged at once, hoping to overwhelm Jack with numbers. But Jack had spent years training for situations far worse than this. He sidestepped the first, using the man's momentum to send him sprawling into his companion. Both bikers hit the ground in a tangle of limbs. By now, the rest of the gang hesitated, their confidence replaced by fear. Bear struggled to his feet, his face twisted with rage. "You think you're tough, huh?" Bear growled. "Let's see how tough you are when we all take you down." Jack's expression didn't change. He stood in the center of the circle, calm and composed. "If you want to keep going, that's up to you," he said. "But I promise you'll regret it." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just some trucker with a quick temper. Jack was something else entirely, something they didn't want to mess with. Bear clenched his fists, his pride warring with his common sense. Finally, he spat on the ground, signaling his retreat. "Let's go," he barked, turning toward his bike. The gang followed, their bravado shattered. Engines roared to life as they sped out of the parking lot, their departure as loud and chaotic as their arrival. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. When the noise faded into the distance, he turned and walked back into the diner. The patrons stared at him as he entered, their faces a mix of shock and awe. Jack ignored the attention, heading back to his booth to finish his coffee. The waitress approached cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you okay?" she asked. Jack nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Coffee's still warm," he said. "I'll be fine." The tension in the diner began to ease as conversations resumed, the events of the past few minutes turning into whispered stories that would no doubt be told for weeks to come. Jack took another sip of his coffee, his mind already shifting back to the road ahead. He wasn't looking for thanks, and he didn't need anyone's admiration. He was just a man passing through, doing what needed to be done. But as he left the truck stop that night, the lingering glances from the patrons told him one thing: they would never forget the quiet man who had stood up to the wolves and sent them running. The diner fell silent, every pair of eyes locked on Jack and Bear. The other bikers, caught off guard by the swift and controlled takedown, hesitated. They had ridden into this truck stop confident they could take on anyone, but now, the image of their invincible leader crumpled on the floor was hard to process. Jack stepped back, his hands at his sides, relaxed but ready. He glanced at Bear, who was grimacing as he cradled his wrist, and then at the rest of the gang. His gray eyes swept over them like a commander assessing a battlefield, calm and deliberate. "No one else needs to get hurt," Jack said, his voice steady but firm. "Go back to your table. Have your meal. Leave the trouble outside." Bear growled, struggling to his feet. His pride had taken a hit far worse than the pain in his arm. "You think you're some kind of hero, old man," he spat, his voice shaky with rage. "You've got no idea who you're messing with." Jack tilted his head slightly, considering Bear's words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded handkerchief, wiping his hands as if dismissing the moment entirely. "You'd be surprised how much I know," he said softly. The gang exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader was fuming, and they could feel the tension brewing. But there was something about Jack that made even the boldest among them hesitate. He wasn't shouting, wasn't making a scene, but the way he moved and spoke, calm, controlled, and deliberate, sent a clear message: he wasn't someone to underestimate. The waitress, still gripping the coffee pot, stood frozen by the counter. Jack glanced at her, his expression softening. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why, yes. Thank you." Jack gave her a small nod before turning back to Bear, who was now standing fully upright but keeping a cautious distance. "Let's end this here," Jack said. "You don't want it to go any further?" Bear's lip curled, but he didn't lunge this time. Instead, he sneered and stepped back toward his table. "This isn't over, old man," he said, his voice dripping with venom. Jack didn't reply. He watched as Bear retreated, his gang reluctantly following him. The tension in the diner eased, but it didn't disappear entirely. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, and people cast wary glances at Jack. As Jack sat back down, his coffee now lukewarm, he felt the weight of the room's attention but didn't acknowledge it. He had no interest in being the center of anyone's story. He was just passing through, and this was supposed to have been a quiet stop. But trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far he tried to stay from it. As the minutes ticked by, Jack noticed the bikers whispering among themselves. Bear's anger hadn't subsided, his red face and clenched fists told Jack he was planning something. Jack sighed inwardly, finishing his coffee and signaling to the waitress for his check. He didn't want to cause more trouble. Not here, not tonight. But his instincts told him this wasn't going to end with Bear backing down. Meanwhile, a trucker sitting at the counter leaned over to Jack as the waitress handed him the check. "That was impressive," the trucker said in a low voice. "Where'd you learn moves like that?" Jack gave a small smile. "Just picked up a thing or two over the years." The trucker chuckled. "Well, you sure picked the right things to learn. Those guys think they run places like this." He glanced nervously at the bikers before continuing. "You're not, you know, in the business, are you?" Jack shook his head. "Just a traveler passing through." The trucker seemed satisfied with the answer, but Jack could tell the man was curious. People always were. He had spent years mastering the art of blending in, of being the kind of person no one gave a second look. But when moments like this arose, his cover often slipped, if only for a second. Jack paid his bill, leaving a generous tip for the waitress. As he stood to leave, he noticed one of the bikers, a younger man with a wiry build and a scar running down his cheek, slip out the door ahead of him. Jack paused, his mind already piecing together the possibilities. He had seen this tactic before. One leaves to set the trap while the rest wait to spring it. The waitress approached him cautiously, her voice low. "Sir, I want to thank you for stepping in. They've been coming here for weeks, scaring off customers, making a mess. But no one's ever stood up to them before." Jack gave her a reassuring smile. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face. The parking lot was quieter now, most of the vehicles gone except for a few trucks and the bikers' motorcycles. Jack scanned the area quickly, his trained eyes picking out details others might miss: the shadow of movement near the edge of the lot, the faint sound of boots scuffing against gravel. He walked toward his truck, his steps calm and unhurried. But inside, his mind was sharp and focused. Bear and 3 of his men emerged from the shadows, their faces twisted with malice. The younger biker who had slipped out earlier stood near the edge of the lot, clearly part of their plan to corner Jack. "You didn't think we were gonna let you walk away, did you?" Bear growled, stepping into the light. Jack stopped, turning to face them. His expression was unreadable, his body language relaxed. "You really want to do this?" he asked. Bear laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You got lucky back there, old man. But now it's just you and us." Jack sighed. He had hoped they'd let it go, but some men didn't know when to back down. "Last chance," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Walk away." Bear's grin faltered for a split second, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He motioned to his men, who moved to surround Jack. Jack stood still, his hands loose at his sides. He wasn't a man looking for a fight, but he was always ready for one. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with," Bear said, stepping closer. Jack's eyes locked onto Bear's, and for the first time, the gang leader saw something in them that made his confidence waver. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something far more unnerving. Experience. Jack had seen men like Bear before. He had faced them in different uniforms, in different countries, under far more dangerous circumstances. And every time, he had walked away, while they had not. "Neither do you," Jack said quietly. The bikers tightened their circle around Jack, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. Bear pulled out a chain, the metal links glinting under the parking lot lights. His men brandished makeshift weapons: a tire iron, a crowbar, and a long, jagged knife. "You might have had a fancy move or two back in the diner," Bear sneered, twirling the chain menacingly. "But out here? We'll see how tough you really are." Jack's gaze shifted, analyzing their stance, their weapons, and the way they moved. His years of training as a Marine had ingrained certain instincts into him: reading people, predicting their actions, and knowing how to respond. Bear lunged first, swinging the chain in a wide arc. It whistled through the air, aimed at Jack's head. But Jack sidestepped with the precision of a man who had danced with danger before. The chain missed him by inches, slamming into the side of a nearby trash can with a metallic clang. Before Bear could recover, Jack grabbed his wrist, twisting it sharply. The chain dropped from Bear's hand as he howled in pain. Jack didn't stop there. He used the momentum to push Bear into one of his men, sending both stumbling backward. The younger biker with the scar stepped in, swinging his tire iron. Jack ducked, his movements fluid and calculated. He delivered a quick, sharp punch to the man's gut, knocking the wind out of him. The biker doubled over, dropping the tire iron, and Jack kicked it out of reach. The remaining two bikers hesitated. They had expected an easy fight, but now they realized they were up against someone who knew how to handle himself. "Get him!" Bear shouted, regaining his footing. The man with the crowbar charged, swinging wildly. Jack deflected the blow with his forearm, using his other hand to grab the attacker's collar. With a swift pivot, he threw the man off balance, sending him sprawling onto the gravel. The last biker, the one holding the knife, advanced cautiously. He jabbed at Jack, but his movements were sloppy, driven by fear rather than skill. Jack dodged the blade, stepping inside the man's guard. He caught the biker's wrist and twisted it, forcing the knife to clatter to the ground. A well-placed elbow to the man's jaw sent him reeling. By now, Bear had recovered and picked up his chain again. He swung it with reckless fury, but Jack was ready. He caught the chain mid-swing, using his strength to yank it out of Bear's grasp. Bear stumbled forward, and Jack delivered a swift kick to his knee, bringing him down. Bear groaned, clutching his leg, his face contorted in pain. The other bikers were either on the ground or staggering to their feet, clearly outmatched. Jack stood tall, the chain dangling loosely from his hand. His breathing was steady, his expression calm but commanding. He looked at the group, his voice low and firm. "You've had your fun," he said. "Now it's over. Leave before you make it worse for yourselves." The younger biker with the scar scrambled to his feet, helping one of his companions up. They looked at Bear, who was still kneeling on the ground, and then back at Jack. "Let's go," the scarred man said, his voice shaking. Bear glared at Jack, his pride clearly wounded, but even he knew when to cut his losses. He spat on the ground and muttered a curse before motioning for his men to follow. The gang retreated to their motorcycles, their tough guy bravado replaced by humiliation. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they sped off into the night, leaving the parking lot eerily quiet once more. As the dust settled, Jack walked back to his truck, his demeanor as calm as ever. He opened the door and reached inside, pulling out a small first aid kit. Sitting on the edge of his truck's step, he began cleaning a scrape on his arm, one of the few marks he had sustained in the scuffle. The trucker from the diner emerged cautiously, his eyes wide with awe. "Man, I don't know who you are, but that was something else," he said. Jack gave a small shrug. "Just a matter of knowing how to handle situations like that." The trucker chuckled nervously. "Yeah, well, most people would have ended up in the hospital or worse. You've got some serious skills." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he packed up the first aid kit and stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Skills like these come from experience," he said finally. "And experience usually comes from situations you'd rather not talk about." The trucker nodded, sensing the weight behind Jack's words. "Well, whatever your story is, I'm glad you were here tonight. Those guys have been terrorizing this place for weeks." Jack gave a small nod. "Sometimes, people like that just need to be reminded they're not invincible." The waitress appeared in the doorway, her face a mix of gratitude and concern. "Sir," she called out hesitantly, "are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jack said, his tone reassuring. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Jack offered her a faint smile. "Just doing what anyone should." As he climbed into his truck, Jack couldn't help but feel the weight of the evening settling over him. He had left the Marines years ago, but moments like these reminded him that some things never truly stayed in the past. The instincts, the discipline, the need to protect it was all still there, buried beneath the surface, waiting to emerge when needed. He started the engine, the low rumble filling the quiet night. As he pulled out of the truck stop, the events of the evening replayed in his mind. He wasn't one to dwell on the past, but he knew that tonight's encounter was just another chapter in a story that was far from over. because trouble, as always, had a way of finding him. Bear's glare was filled with equal parts rage and uncertainty, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He took a step forward, his injured arm hanging limp at his side. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh? You don't know who you're messing with." Jack tilted his head slightly, his gray eyes locking onto Bear's. "That's the thing," Jack said evenly. "You don't know who you're messing with." The room hung in tense silence, the bikers exchanging nervous glances. They had underestimated Jack from the moment they laid eyes on him. His calm demeanor, his understated presence, it all masked something far more dangerous. Bear, sensing his authority slipping, barked at his crew. "Don't just stand there. Get him." The remaining bikers hesitated for a fraction of a second before rushing Jack together, weapons drawn. This wasn't a bar fight anymore, it was an all-out brawl. But Jack didn't flinch. He moved with the precision and efficiency of a man who had faced far worse. The first biker swung a broken pool cue at him. Jack ducked, stepped inside the swing, and delivered a crushing palm strike to the man's chest, sending him sprawling onto a table. The second attacker came from the side, wielding a heavy chain. Jack caught the chain mid-swing, yanking it with enough force to pull the biker off balance. With a swift motion, Jack wrapped the chain around the biker's arm, immobilizing him before delivering a swift kick to his knee, dropping him to the floor. Another biker lunged with a crowbar, but Jack sidestepped and countered with a perfectly executed spinning kick, sending the crowbar clattering across the diner. The man hit the ground hard, groaning in pain. The youngest biker, barely in his 20s, froze in place, his makeshift weapon trembling in his hands. "I don't," he stammered, looking to Bear for guidance. Jack's gaze shifted to the kid, his voice soft but firm. "Don't make a choice you'll regret." The young man dropped his weapon and backed away, his hands raised in surrender. Now it was just Jack and Bear. Bear's face twisted with rage and frustration. He grabbed a metal stool and swung it at Jack with all his strength. Jack ducked, grabbed the stool mid-swing, and ripped it from Bear's hands with a sharp twist. The metal clattered to the ground as Bear stumbled backward. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady but carrying an edge that froze everyone in place. "Enough." Bear hesitated, his chest heaving, his face slick with sweat. "What are you, huh? Some kind of cop? CIA? What's your deal?" Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he adjusted his jacket, the fabric shifting just enough to reveal a patch sewn on the inside of faded insignia of the United States Marine Corps. The sight of it silenced Bear completely. His bravado evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization. "You're military," Bear muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Was," Jack corrected. "I left that life behind a long time ago. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten how to handle men like you." Bear's eyes darted to his crew, those still conscious, anyway. They looked to him for direction, but he had nothing left to give. The fight was over, and everyone in the room knew it. "You think you're better than us?" Bear spat, his tone bitter. "Just because you've got training." "No," Jack said simply. "But I know the difference between strength and bullying. And what you're doing, that's not strength. That's cowardice." The waitress, who had been hiding behind the counter, slowly emerged, her eyes wide with shock. You're a Marine." "Used to be," Jack said, his tone softening as he turned to her. "Just passing through now." The trucker from earlier stepped forward, his expression a mix of awe and gratitude. "Man, you saved us. Those guys have been making life miserable for everyone here." Jack gave a small nod. "Sometimes, bullies just need to be reminded they're not invincible." The younger biker, the one who had dropped his weapon, spoke up hesitantly. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't want this to happen." Jack studied the kid for a moment before nodding. "You've got a choice to make. Don't follow men like him, he said, motioning toward Bear. There's a better path if you're willing to take it. The kid nodded quickly, backing away toward the exit. As the bikers began to retreat, Bear made one last desperate move. He lunged for the knife on the floor, his hand closing around the handle. Jack reacted instantly. In one fluid motion, he stepped forward, kicking the knife out of Bear's hand before he could even raise it. Bear yelped in pain, clutching his fingers. Jack leaned in close, his voice low but unmistakably firm. Walk away, Bear. This is over. For a moment, it seemed like Bear might argue, but the look in Jack's eyes left no room for negotiation. Finally, Bear staggered to his feet, his head hanging low. Let's go, he muttered to his crew. One by one, the bikers shuffled out of the diner, their pride shattered and their swagger gone. The roar of their motorcycles echoed into the night as they disappeared down the highway. The diner was quiet again, the tension slowly dissipating. The waitress approached Jack cautiously, her hands still trembling. I don't know how to thank you, she said. Jack shook his head. No thanks needed. Just take care of yourself. The trucker extended a hand, his grip firm. If you ever need anything, you've got a friend here. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Jack gave a faint smile but said nothing. He gathered his things and headed for the door, pausing briefly to glance back at the room. The people inside looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. As Jack stepped into the cool night air, he felt a familiar weight settle over him, not regret, but a quiet understanding that his past would always be a part of him. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, and Jack climbed into his truck, ready to move on. Trouble might have a way of finding him, but tonight, he had reminded it why it never lingered for long. The engine roared to life, and Jack drove into the darkness, leaving the diner and the echoes of a battle won behind him. As the roar of the motorcycles faded into the night, the air inside the diner grew heavier, like the aftermath of a sudden storm. The waitress stood frozen near the counter, her wide eyes darting between Jack and the door, as if expecting the bikers to return. Jack, now seated once more at his booth, quietly picked up his coffee cup. The liquid had gone cold, but he didn't seem to mind. He sipped slowly, his expression calm, though his posture betrayed a subtle alertness. Years of discipline had taught him never to fully let his guard down, even when the battle appeared to be over. The trucker, who had taken refuge near the jukebox, cautiously approached Jack. His face was a mix of awe and curiosity. "Mister," he began, his voice gruff but sincere, "I don't know where you came from, but you've got guts. Nobody's ever stood up to those guys like that." Jack looked up, his gaze meeting the trucker's. "Sometimes, standing up isn't about guts. It's about necessity." He set his coffee down and leaned back slightly. "They were going to hurt someone eventually. Better me than you." The trucker scratched his head, clearly still processing what he had just witnessed. "Well, whatever it was, you saved a lot of people tonight. That Bear guy, he's been running wild around these parts for months. Scaring folks, roughing up anyone who got in his way." He hesitated before adding, "You sure you ain't some kinda cop?" Jack's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Nope. Just someone passing through." As the trucker returned to his table, the waitress, Maria, her name a tag catching the light, finally mustered the courage to approach Jack. She held a fresh pot of coffee in trembling hands. "Can I top you off?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jack nodded, sliding his cup toward her. "Thanks." Maria poured carefully, her hands still unsteady but determined. "I've worked here for 6 years, she said quietly, her words spilling out like a confession. "Those guys have been coming in for the last 2, and every time, it's worse. They break things, scare people. I don't know how we're supposed to deal with them." Jack regarded her thoughtfully. You shouldn't have to deal with them, he said after a moment. That's not your job. Maria bit her lip, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. But who else will? The police barely show up when we call. It's like they're too scared, or they just don't care. Jack's gaze softened. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to protect us fall short, he said, his voice low. But that doesn't mean you're powerless. Maria frowned, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean? Jack leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You saw what happened tonight. Strength doesn't come from brute force. It comes from knowing how to stand your ground when it matters. He paused, letting his words sink in. You've got that strength, Maria. You just need to believe it. Maria stared at him, her expression shifting from uncertainty to something resembling hope. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of sincerity. For everything. Meanwhile, outside in the dim parking lot, Bear stood by his bike, nursing his wounded pride as much as his bruised body. His crew loitered nearby, their earlier bravado replaced by a tense silence. The younger biker who had surrendered inside the diner shuffled his feet awkwardly, his eyes fixed on the ground. Cowards, Bear muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with venom. All of you. Letting some old man humiliate us like that. One of the older bikers, a wiry man with a deep scar running down his cheek, spoke up. Bear, you saw what he did. That guy's not normal. He's. Bear cut him off with a sharp glare. I don't care what he is, he snapped. Nobody makes a fool of me and gets away with it. The scarred biker hesitated before replying, his tone cautious. What's the plan, then? Bear's eyes glinted with malice. We're not done with him. Not by a long shot. Back inside the diner, Jack finished his coffee and stood, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing out the creases, and glanced toward Maria. Take care of yourself, he said simply. Maria nodded, her expression a mix of gratitude and concern. You too. The trucker called out from his booth, you ever come back through here, first cups on me. Jack gave a small wave but didn't respond. He pushed open the diner door, the bell jingling softly as he stepped out into the cool night air. The parking lot was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of a distant highway. Jack's truck waited for him, its silhouette imposing under the dim light of a nearby lamp post. But before he reached it, a voice cut through the stillness. Going somewhere, old man. Jack turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Bear and his crew blocking his path. Their earlier humiliation had been replaced with something darker, more dangerous. Bear stepped forward, his injured arm hanging awkwardly at his side. You think you can just walk away after what you did? Nah, it doesn't work like that. Jack sighed, his patience once again wearing thin. You don't want to do this. Bear laughed, a harsh, hollow sound. Oh, I think I do. What followed was swift and brutal. Bear's crew charged again, but this time, there was no hesitation, no holding back on Jack's part. He moved like a force of nature, dismantling their attacks with the precision of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of combat. One by one, the bikers fell. The scarred man tried to tackle Jack from behind, only to find himself flipped onto the asphalt, gasping for air. Another swung a tire iron, but Jack sidestepped effortlessly, delivering a sharp strike to the man's wrist that sent the weapon clattering to the ground. Even Bear, fueled by rage and desperation, was no match. Jack disarmed him with a single, devastating blow, leaving him sprawled on the ground, his face contorted in pain. When it was over, Jack stood amidst the wreckage, his breath steady, his expression calm. The bikers groaned and writhed on the ground, their earlier bravado reduced to pitiful whimpers. Jack looked down at Bear, his voice low but firm. Strength isn't about how loud you roar. It's about knowing when to walk away. Bear didn't respond. He couldn't. As Jack climbed into his truck and started the engine, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. Trouble had found him again, as it always seemed to. But tonight, at least, he had left things a little better than he'd found them. With the hum of the engine beneath him and the open road stretching ahead, Jack drove off into the night, ready for whatever lay beyond the horizon. Behind him, the diner stood in quiet solitude, a beacon of resilience in a world that sometimes needed reminding of what true strength looked like. The diner's air felt lighter after Jack left, though the weight of the events lingered in the expressions of everyone who had witnessed it. Maria, the waitress, stared out the window, her hands clutching the counter for support. Her mind replayed the encounter, the precision, the calm authority, the sheer skill Jack had demonstrated. It wasn't something you saw every day, especially not in a sleepy truck stop on Highway 74. The trucker who had spoken to Jack earlier leaned back in his seat, shaking his head in disbelief. "I knew there was something different about that guy," he muttered, half to himself and half to anyone within earshot. "Marine Corps. Explains everything." Maria glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Explains a lot, sure. But what kind of life must he have lived to be like that?" She sighed, pouring herself a cup of coffee as if it might steady her nerves. "I hope he finds peace, wherever he's headed." Inside their huddle near the diner window, the bikers spoke in hushed tones. Bear sat slumped in his seat, his arm still throbbing from Jack's earlier maneuver. He stared at the Marine Corps emblem on Jack's truck as it disappeared down the highway, his teeth clenched in a mix of pain and humiliation. "That guy, he's not just some old man," Bear muttered, his voice barely audible. "No kidding," one of his crew replied, rubbing his bruised ribs. "What do we do now?" Bear didn't answer immediately. His pride had taken a beating, but deeper than that, he felt fear, a raw, unfamiliar sensation he wasn't used to confronting. Finally, he growled, "We lay low. For now." One of the younger bikers, emboldened by distance from Jack, scoffed. "What? Just let him walk away after humiliating us?" Bear shot him a glare that silenced him immediately. "You think I'm going after a Marine? A guy who moves like that?" He shook his head, the memory of Jack's calm but deadly demeanor replaying in his mind. "We're lucky he didn't finish the job." The others nodded reluctantly. They were bruised, battered, and scared, and for the first time, they were forced to reckon with the consequences of their reckless behavior. As the bikers filed out of the diner, still licking their wounds, Maria watched them go with a mix of relief and defiance. For years, they had terrorized the truck stop, treating it like their personal playground. But tonight, that had changed. She set her coffee cup down and glanced at the trucker. "Do you think they'll be back?" The trucker shook his head. "Not after what happened tonight. If they're smart, they'll steer clear of this place for a long time." Maria exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "Good. We deserve a break." The older man offered her a small smile. "That guy Jack, was it, he gave you more than a break? He gave you a chance to take your power back." Maria tilted her head, considering the words. "Maybe. But he's the one who showed us how." Jack's truck rumbled down the highway, the rhythmic hum of the engine a soothing counterpoint to the chaos he had left behind. His face was impassive, but his mind was active, turning over the events of the night. He didn't relish confrontation. It was never about winning or proving anything. For Jack, it was about doing what needed to be done, stepping in where others couldn't or wouldn't. The Marine Corps decal on his window wasn't just a symbol of his past, it was a reminder of the values that had shaped him: honor, courage, and commitment. Even in retirement, those values guided him. Back at the truck stop, news of the incident began to spread. Travelers whispered about the lone Marine who had taken down an entire gang without breaking a sweat. Stories grew in the telling, turning Jack into something of a legend among the regulars. Maria, however, clung to the reality of the man she had met. He wasn't just a hero in the moment, he was someone who understood what it meant to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. She started making small changes around the diner. A sign went up on the wall near the counter, "Respect our staff and customers, or you'll be asked to leave." The next time a rowdy group came through, Maria stood taller, her voice firmer. She wasn't the same person who had hesitated to speak up. Jack's example had shown her the strength she had within. Weeks later, a convoy of motorcyclists passed by the truck stop but didn't dare pull in. Bear and his gang had made sure everyone in their circle knew the story of the Marine who had put them in their place. The truck stop had become an unofficial no-go zone for troublemakers, a reputation that gave Maria and the other employees a newfound sense of security. Jack, meanwhile, continued his journey. Each stop brought new faces, new challenges, but his principles never wavered. Wherever he went, he left behind a quiet but powerful reminder: sometimes, the strongest actions come not from anger, but from the calm certainty of doing what's right. One evening, parked at a rest area miles away, Jack sat on the hood of his truck, staring up at the stars. He thought about the waitress, the trucker, and even the bikers. Life was complicated, and people made choices for all kinds of reasons: fear, pride, desperation. But Jack's path was clear. He wasn't out to change the world, but he could change moments. And sometimes, that was enough. With a deep breath, he climbed back into his truck and started the engine. The road stretched out before him, endless and open, a place where justice didn't always come in grand gestures but in small, steady acts of courage. And for Jack Carter, that was a road worth traveling. As Jack's truck disappeared down the road, the quiet of the night seemed to stretch out even further. The sound of the engine faded, leaving only the soft hum of the wind. The stars above gleamed in their eternal dance, untouched by the struggles of the world below. The truck stop, once a place filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt at peace, almost as if it had been reset, given a second chance. Inside the diner, Maria stood by the window, her gaze lingering on the road where Jack had vanished. Her hands, no longer trembling, wiped down the counter as she let out a long breath, a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding all evening. The weight of the night's events slowly lifted, replaced by something new, a quiet sense of gratitude. She thought of Jack. He hadn't been a hero in the traditional sense. He hadn't stood on some grand stage or made speeches about justice. No, Jack had been a man of action, a man who did what needed to be done without asking for recognition or reward. He had walked into that diner, minding his own business, and when trouble came to him, he handled it with calm precision. And then, just as quietly, he left. No fanfare. No need to prove anything. He simply showed up and took care of what was right. Maria leaned against the counter, reflecting on how much had changed in just a few hours. She had always been a little afraid of confrontation, a little uncertain about standing her ground when the moment called for it. But seeing Jack, watching how he stood tall and didn't back down, had shown her something important. Strength didn't always have to be loud. It didn't need to be intimidating or filled with anger. Real strength was steady. It was quiet, but it was also undeniable. Across the diner, the trucker who had been there when the bikers caused their trouble was now sitting with a cup of coffee, still shaking his head in disbelief. He had seen it all, he'd said. But even he couldn't shake the image of Jack, the way he had moved, the way he had stood up against the bikers. It wasn't the fight that stuck with him, it was the fact that Jack hadn't been looking for it. He wasn't out to prove anything. He was simply a man who knew what he was capable of, and who chose to use his skills only when absolutely necessary. That's when the trucker spoke again, more quietly this time, to no one in particular. "You know, Sometimes you don't need to make noise to make an impact. Sometimes, it's just the way you handle yourself that makes the difference. Maria smiled softly at his words. She knew exactly what he meant now. Far down the highway, Jack Carter kept driving, the soft hum of his truck comforting him as he pushed forward into the night. He had seen much in his years, had done things he never spoke about. There was a time when his past had haunted him, when the weight of his decisions, his training, his years of service, seemed like too much to carry. But tonight, something had shifted. It wasn't the fight with the bikers. That was just a moment, one that could have turned ugly but hadn't. No, it was the stillness that followed, the quiet reassurance he felt after the storm had passed. It was the knowledge that sometimes, the most important victories were the ones no one ever saw. No one would ever know what Jack had done at that diner. They wouldn't hear the way his movements had spoken louder than any words could. They wouldn't understand the quiet strength it took to stay calm, to be patient, to walk away when he could have easily stayed and fought. Jack had been to places most people would never dream of. He'd fought battles on foreign soil. He'd faced death and stared it down. But in the end, what mattered wasn't the battles he'd fought, it was the way he carried himself in the moments that followed. The way he refused to let his past define him. The way he chose, again and again, to do what was right, no matter how small or quiet the moment seemed. He had learned long ago that the world didn't need more noise. It didn't need more chaos or more drama. What it needed was people who knew who they were and what they stood for. What it needed was quiet strength, the kind that didn't demand attention but always commanded respect. Jack had learned that lesson through years of service, through the countless battles he had fought both abroad and within himself. And now, as he drove into the night, the headlights of his truck illuminating the long, winding road ahead, Jack knew that no matter where he went, he would continue to carry that strength with him. It was a strength that didn't scream for attention. It didn't try to prove anything to anyone. It was simply there, steady and unshakable, a quiet force that was always ready when needed. Back at the truck stop, the day had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The bikers were long gone, their arrogance shattered by the unexpected turn of events. The employees, now a little wiser, went about their work with a new sense of confidence. The truck stop, once a place where fear lingered in the air, now felt like a place of quiet resilience. Maria, though she couldn't explain it, felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. The small acts of courage, the choices to stand firm, had added up in a way that felt meaningful. She had learned that it wasn't always about winning big battles, it was about the little victories, the moments when you chose to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. And Jack? He was a reminder that sometimes, doing the right thing wasn't about standing in the spotlight. It wasn't about making sure everyone knew your name. Sometimes, it was about walking away when you could have stayed, about leaving an impact without trying to make one. As the truck stop grew quieter and the stars above continued their silent watch, the lesson was clear: true power doesn't come from making noise. It comes from knowing when to be silent, when to stand firm, and when to walk away, because sometimes, just doing the right thing is all the strength anyone needs. The quiet road stretched out before Jack, and he knew one thing for certain: strength was never about showing off. It was about knowing your value, understanding what you stood for, and letting the world see it through your actions, not your words. The night was calm. The road was long. And Jack Carter, with his quiet strength, had already won.